she comes, Theodore said to himself. He could see Emily coming towards the big harbor, pulling a ship. Theodore floated back and forth near Bedford Buoy at the entrance to the harbor. He was so excited to see Emily, he was almost bursting his bumpers. "Hello, Emily," he shouted. "Hello, Theodore," called Emily. "It's nice that you're waiting for me." Emily had been away on an adventure. She'd been out in the ocean to rescue the ship she was pulling. "Tell me everything that happened, Emily," said Theodore as he floated up alongside her. "Did you visit any great places?" "Not really," replied Emily. "You always have to go straight to the ship when you're on a rescue mission." "Oh, sure, I know," said Theodore. "Tell me about the ship, Emily." "She broke a propeller on a giant iceberg," said Emily, "so she couldn't move by herself." "It must have been really hard to pull her all this way," said Theodore. "It was," Emily replied, "but I had my extra strong towing cable. You always have to bring an extra strong towing cable on a rescue mission." "Sure, I know," said Theodore impatiently. "But tell me, Emily, what else happened?" "Well," continued Emily, "a big storm came up. Well, that's why I took so long to get home. You have to go really slow when you're pulling a ship through a storm." "I know," said Theodore. To Emily's surprise, Theodore turned to go. You see, Theodore was upset. He had never been on a rescue mission like Emily, but having her tell him things he already had heard about being safe, well, it made him feel like he was just a small tugboat, and he didn't really like that feeling. "I know all about rescues," he said to himself. The next morning, the tugs were all gathered round the dispatcher at the Great Ocean Tug and Salvage Company dock. The dispatcher was just beginning the morning work meeting. "Tugboats," he said in a very worried voice, "Digby the cable ship is stuck again." "Not again," said Foduck. You see, it seems Digby is always getting stuck somewhere. "Yes, he's in a little cove just outside the harbor," continued the dispatcher. "I will have to send one of you tugs to rescue him." The dispatcher carefully looked around to see which tugs were on duty that day. Well, Theodore just held his breath, and then the dispatcher said the magic words. "Theodore, I think you might be able to go on this rescue mission. Do you think you can do that?" "Yes, I know how," shouted Theodore, almost before the dispatcher had stopped talking. "I want you to go straight there," cautioned the dispatcher. "Do not dawdle." "Sure, I know," said Theodore. "And take an extra strong towing cable." "I know," said Theodore. "And," concluded the dispatcher, "go slow. You take your time." "I know," said Theodore, already turning from the dock. "Theodore," called the dispatcher. "I know," shouted Theodore. "Theodore, your tow rope is still tied to the dock," the dispatcher said. The other tugs all laughed. "I knew that," said Theodore quietly. Theodore set off with a smile as wide as a wave. He swayed a bit from side to side, the way he always did when he was especially happy. "I'm going on a rescue mission!" He was so happy he shouted it to the whole ocean. Theodore glanced toward the ocean. It was where he'd always dreamed of sailing, and now it seemed so near. Maybe I'll just go out a little bit, he thought. He turned towards the open water. Theodore was so excited he could feel his engine pounding deep in his hull. Galumpa, galumpa, galumpa. It seemed the further he went, the louder his engine pounded. The whitecaps on the water looked as if they were just waiting for him to splash through. "Yikes!" cried Theodore. "What was that?" A great whoosh of wind hit him. "A storm must be coming," he gasped. And then he realized that he'd been drifting and dreaming, and meanwhile a winter storm was roaring in from the cold north. It was then Theodore remembered the dispatcher's warning. "Go straight to Digby." Theodore turned towards the cove where Digby was stuck. "I hope I'm not too late to save Digby." Well, by the time Theodore reached the small cove, the storm was raging all around him. The waves were wicked, and the salt sea stung his face. Digby! Digby! He cried. Where are you?
Here I am, Theodore.
A small voice replied. Theodore gasped out loud. Digby was stuck up on a sand spit near some sharp rocks. The storm battered into the small ship and made him reel and rock this way and that. The waves were washing all over his deck.
Well, what took you so long, Theodore?
Said Digby.
I thought you was coming straight here. I'm halfway to drown.
If I had done what the dispatcher said, thought Theodore, I would have come straight here before this storm. It was too late now. Theodore had to save Digby, storm or no storm. Don't worry, I'll rescue you, Theodore shouted boldly. I know what to do. Theodore got as close to that dangerous sand spit as he dared go with those woeful waves crashing down around him, and he tied his towrope onto Digby. Get ready, called Theodore, and he gave a mighty tug on his rope. Nothing happened. Digby barely budged. You really are stuck, frowned Theodore.
I was out here laying this here cable of mine,
Explained Digby.
and not watching where I was going like they told me to do. Ran right up on this gibberty-spiggity sand spit. Broke my propeller, too.
Hang on, Digby, called Theodore. He grunted and groaned and pulled as hard as he could. There was a great scraping sound as Theodore dragged Digby a little along the sand spit. Theodore! Cried Digby. Your tow rope is after snapping on you! It was a sight that made Theodore's heart sink. His tow rope was about to break. He had to stop pulling Digby. All my barnacles and me bumpers, cried Digby. What are we going to do now, Theodore? I know, shouted Theodore. I'll use my extra strong towing cable.
And where might that be?
Called Digby. And that's when Theodore remembered. He didn't have his extra strong towing cable. He had forgotten to bring it. Why didn't I listen to the dispatcher? Groaned Theodore. He said I should have brought an extra cable. Theodore knew that without a cable, he wouldn't be able to do the job he was sent to do. And poor Digby might be lost. If only I had a cable, he cried. Yep, hollered Digby. Big cables is always good to have. Of course, me being a cable ship and all, naturally, I like cables just fine. Theodore, I think I'm going to sink now. Cables, said Theodore suddenly. I can use your cables to pull you out. Great idea, declared Digby. But, Theodore, do you think you can hurry? Unroll some cables, shouted Theodore. Theodore knew he'd have to float in just the right place to catch Digby's cable. In that dreadful storm, he'd only have one chance. One chance to save Digby. Now, cried Theodore. Let your cable go! The cable went snaking out from Digby. Theodore turned some more. His anchor swung around. His engine seemed to skip a beat, then... You did it, Theodore! You did it! Theodore had caught the cable with his anchor. Hang on, Digby, called Theodore. I gotta pull you out now. The wind and the waves were all against him, but Digby's cable was strong, and so was Theodore's courage. And at last, Digby budged just a bit, and then, hooray! He slid free of the sand spit and splashed into the water, safe. Theodore pulled Digby from the cove and turned towards the harbor. I better go as fast as I can before the storm gets worse, he said to himself, and he turned his engine up full. But it seemed the faster Theodore tried to go, the harder it was to pull Digby. Digby wobbled this way and that on the end of his cable, just like a yo-yo on a string. Stop wobbling so much. I can't pull you. But I can't float straight with this broken propeller of mine, called Digby. I'm not strong enough, groaned Theodore. If only Emily was here, he thought. Slow, he said to himself. Didn't the dispatcher tell me to go slow with Digby? Maybe I should try that. Theodore slowed down, and oh, it was wonderful. Digby stopped wobbling.
Oh, this is much better,
Called Digby.
I was getting seasick, and I'm a ship.
Well, it wasn't long before Theodore saw a wonderful sight. There was Emily, waiting for him near Bedford Buoy.
We're home, Theodore. We're home.
Emily floated excitedly towards Theodore. She couldn't wait to talk to him. Hello, Theodore, she shouted. Hello, Emily, called Theodore. It's so nice that you're waiting for me. Tell me all about it, Theodore, Emily pleaded. Well, Emily's words felt great to Theodore. Now he was coming home from an adventure. It was his turn to tell all about the great things he had done. But he didn't. Emily, he said, I should have paid attention to everyone's warnings. The rescue was very hard, and I got in trouble. It must have been really scary in that storm trying to rescue Digby, said Emily. It was, agreed Theodore. And I forgot a lot of important things. Oh, it's always hard to remember everything the first time, Emily said after a moment. It was for me, too. You, too? Said Theodore slowly. Emily smiled. Sure. I bet you'll do just great next time. See you at the dock. See you, Emily, called Theodore. Somehow, her words made him feel much better. Theodore turned Digby towards the repair dock. He was very tired, but he smiled to himself. Next time, he thought, how far will I go next time? Late one day, Theodore and Photok were floating home together. Guess who I saw? It was Benjamin Bridge. Who did you see? Asked Theodore. Someone smaller than me and made from a tree, said Benjamin mysteriously. Benjamin always loves telling riddles about all the things he can see from way up there. Smaller than Benjamin, said Theodore. That's just about everyone. Said Photok. Made from a tree. That means made of wood. Was it a dock? No, said Benjamin. I saw a canoe. A canoe? Repeated Theodore. You know, said Photok. A canoe is a small boat made from tree bark, like Kulu. Right, boomed Benjamin. Kulu! That's who I saw! Kulu? Theodore shouted. Kulu's come to visit? Oh, no, Photok mumbled to himself. Not again. Back at the Great Ocean Dock, the dispatcher had a special announcement. Tugboats, he began, I have decided that tonight, because Kulu is visiting, you may go and listen to some of his stories. Hooray! Shouted Hank. Great! Roared George. Terrific! Tooted Theodore and Emily. Phooey! Groaned Photok. Theodore, whispered Hank, why doesn't Photok like Kulu's stories? I think Photok likes stories about real things, said Theodore quietly. Now, Photok really didn't want to go listen to Kulu's stories, but the other tugs asked him to shine the way with a special light. Hidden Cove is far from the bright lights of the harbor. Even with Photok's light, it was still quite dark. The tugs looked this way and that way, but they didn't see Kulu. Look, Theodore said softly. Kulu, the canoe, was suddenly there, touched by the first faint fingers of the silvery moon. He always just kind of appears, breathed Emily. I wonder where he does come from, said Hank in a hushed voice. Come closer, Kulu was calling to the tugs. The tugs could see the canoe clearly now. He was made all of bark from a birch tree and had a beautiful rounded shape. "We were wondering," said Theodore. "That is, we all hoped you could tell us a story." "Yes, a story," said Hank, moving closer.
A really good story.
Said George.
But not too long.
Grumbled Foduck. Foduck aimed his special light in the middle of the circle of tugboats. And that made it kind of like a campfire. And Kulu began his story. "This is a story about the Northern Lights," said Kulu. "Ooh," said Hank, "the Northern Lights." "Long, long ago," continued Kulu, "there was a great canoe built from the bark of a single tree. Her name was Kikuk." "Ah," said Hank, "Kikuk is a nice name." "Shh," whispered the other tugs. "Kikuk loved to sail far, far from where the other canoes lived," Kulu went on. "Sometimes she would sail so far from home, she would get lost." "How did she ever find her way home?" asked Emily. "She had a special paddle," replied Kulu, "and it always pointed the way home." "Like your paddle," said Theodore. "Yes," said Kulu, "my paddle always points my way home." One day, there was a big storm, and Kikuk lost her paddle.
"Well, how'd she find her way home?"
asked George. "The old canoes," explained Kulu, "who live in the sky, floated back and forth and back and forth. And their ripples made magic ripples of light in the sky." "Just like the ripples we make when we move through the water," said Hank. "Kikuk followed the bright ripples of light," continued Kulu, "and they led her all the way home. They call those ripples of light the Northern Lights. And on very special nights, you can still see them dancing in the sky above." "What a great story," said Theodore. "Can you tell us another one?" "Of course," said Kulu. Just then there was a deep rumble of thunder. "We'll have to have our story tomorrow," said Emily. "It sounds like a storm is coming." The tugs floated home to their dock, still talking about Kulu's story. "I hope I get to see the Northern Lights one day," said Theodore.
Well, I've never seen them, huffed Foduck. "I don't believe any of Kulu's make-believe stories."
Well, it stormed all night, a terrible storm, and the next day, too. Of course, work in the big harbor never stops, storm or no storm. Theodore and Foduck were docking a ship. "Don't forget, we're going to visit Kulu when we're finished," called Theodore. "He promised to tell us another story."
"Oh, you go ahead," answered Foduck. "I don't want to hear those silly old stories."
"But you know the way to Hidden Cove," said Theodore. Now, Foduck liked being the one who knew things.
"Well," he said at last, "I suppose so."
Well, by the time Theodore and Foduck reached Hidden Cove, the storm was almost over. The sky was beginning to clear. The tugs looked around, but Kulu was nowhere to be found.
"He's not here," said Foduck.
"Well, that's funny," frowned Theodore. "He promised to tell us a story." Foduck was already turning to go when Theodore saw a sight that almost stopped his engine. "That's Kulu's paddle," he gasped.
"Well, maybe he forgot it,"
said Foduck. "Oh, he'd never leave without his paddle," said Theodore. "It points his way home." Well, this time Foduck didn't say anything. You see, he really didn't believe that Kulu's paddle was magic. Theodore put Kulu's paddle up on his deck, and the two tugs set off into the gathering dark to search for him. They looked everywhere, but there was no Kulu to be seen. There is one place we haven't looked, said Theodore quietly. Shipwreck Rock.
Well, what makes you think Kulu's at Shipwreck Rock?
Said Fodak. He's there, said Theodore. I just know. Well, by the time those tired tugs had almost reached Shipwreck Rock, it was night. Fodak turned on his light, but then it just went out.
Oh, I must have worn it out when I was shining it during Kulu's stories,
groaned Fodak. We'll never find Kulu now, said Theodore sadly.
It's getting late, said Fodak. We really better go home, Theodore. Theodore? Theodore?
Theodore was staring at something. Something, well, it seemed almost magical. What is it? Fodak said. Lights, said Theodore. Thousands and thousands of lights. They look like ripples in the sky, said Fodak slowly. Didn't Kulu say, whispered Theodore, that you can see ripples of light when the old canoes float back and forth in the sky? The Northern Lights, gasped Theodore. Those must be the Northern Lights.
I didn't believe there were such things, gasped Fodak. They're so beautiful.
Look, cried Theodore. There! Fodak turned, and there, in the glow of the Northern Lights, was Kulu. The storm had tossed him right up on the sand near Shipwreck Rock. Theodore pulled Kulu gently down from the sand with his tow rope. How did you ever find me? Said Kulu. Oh, smiled Theodore. We had some help.
From some old friends of yours,
added Fodak. They all looked up at the Northern Lights. Yes, said Kulu. They are good friends.
Kulu, said Fodak, do you know any more stories?